Two guys are standing on a grassy hill and looking at the wide open spaces. A guy with brown hair is holding a shovel, and a guy with white hair is holding a flag. Four weird little animals are sitting at their feet. The white flag with symbols is fluttering in the wind. The brunette is happy, smiles, and looks into the distance, while his friend is calm. The little animals are charged with energy. The brunette mentally greets the viewer and says that his name is Kim Sool. The little animals are shouting out sounds one by one. The hero corrects himself and says that here his name is Lloyd Fra. The hero swings his shovel with a smile and plunges it into the ground. The ground under the hero's feet begins to glow, and a large blue circle appears under him, lined with a checkered pattern. The circle begins to expand, and all the surroundings around the heroes turn into a blue checkered field. A model of skyscrapers begins to appear above the ground from glowing lines. The hero says that this is the story of an ordinary civil engineer. The vast expanses begin to turn into a model of a city with skyscrapers. The hero continues that this builder has completely changed the world. The hero looks at the model of the city spread out under the mountains. He addresses his partner by the name Xavier, to which Xavier calmly responds, "Yes, Mr. Lloyd." Lloyd spreads his arms in a crazy smile and shouts that it is all money. Mr. Lloyd laughs loudly, to which Xavier asks if his master has gone crazy. A medieval town at night several years ago. A notification appeared that the hero had chosen the absolute and that he could make a wish. A congratulation appeared. The guy lay on the ground dissatisfied and looked at the congratulations. The notification said that he had become one of the heroes of the novel, The Knight of Iron and Blood. The hero opened his mouth in surprise. The thought came to him that perhaps this was a migration into a body from another world, which often appears in web novels. The hero assumed that he had ended up in another world. The hero was lying in the middle of the road leading to the city. He did not understand why he woke up, having fallen to the ground. He convulsively got up and complained about the night cold. The guy's mouth shifted to the side and was cartoonishly small, which caused him reasonable surprise. A red notification bar appeared. It said that the mouth was crooked as a result of sleeping on the street. The guy slapped the notification window with displeasure, annoyed by his style of speaking. He adjusted his mouth and said that he had moved into the body of the hero of the novel, wondering who he had become in this novel. The hero called himself a man living in a village and sleeping on the road. Someone called out, "Mr. Lloyd," and the guy turned thoughtfully. An unknown figure approached the surprised brunette. The man said that he had been looking for him for a long time. A golden sword guard peeked out from behind his belt. The man's hair was silver like the moon. A calm guy in a blue semblance of a uniform stood in front of the hero and asked him to return to the mansion. This was the main character of the novel, Xavier. The brunette broke out in a cold sweat. In his thoughts, he noted that Xavier was the same as in the pictures of the novel. He noticed that he was addressed by the name of Lloyd. Xavier, in a cloak and with a glowing sword, was a swordmaster who, as the plot of the novel developed, became famous throughout the continent. But at the beginning of the novel, he was only a night guard for the Baron, whose eldest son's name was the hero. Suddenly, the hero realized who he was and screamed, "Was I really that prankster, Lloyd Fra?" Xavier looked calmly at the flesh boy. A slight surprise touched his face, and he said that he did not call the boy a prankster, only called him by name. Xavier smiled slightly and said, "Well, that Lloyd correctly assessed himself." The notification reported that Xavier looked pleased, to which Lloyd mentally asked the notification to shut up. In front of the heroes was a large two-story mansion in the night. Xavier stirred the wood in the fireplace and asked the hero if he remembered how he ended up on the road. Lloyd sat wrapped in a warm blanket, while Xavier explained to him that Lloyd had been drinking since dinner, broke all the dishes in the tavern, then got homesick and fell asleep on the way. In his mind, Lloyd noted that this was expected on the day of the prankster. Xavier continued to explain that the Baron was worried about his son and sent him away. He noted that even if the son was a prankster, the Baron would be sad if his son died on the street with a crooked mouth. Lloyd noted that Xavier spoke without any fear. Lloyd felt the floor and dreamed of a heated floor, but suddenly realized that he was in a medieval fantasy. Xavier turned around and told the hero to rest, and said that he would report to the Baron about his tricks tomorrow morning, to which Lloyd asked not to tell and immediately received a negative answer. Xavier was impenetrable like a wall. He had already opened the door. As Lloyd turned to him, the guy with a strange smile asked if they had much light at home. Xavier closed his eyes, surprised by the strange words. He slammed the door behind him without answering. The hero silently thought he knew the entire content of this novel. In his world, lying in a narrow room finishing reading the last chapter on his phone, he knew the fate of his character. On the cold floor, the pale hands of the Baron and his wife lay on top of each other. The hero knew that at the very beginning of the novel, they fell for vile swindlers, lost all their fortune, and committed suicide. Lloyd was lying drunk on the table and asking to be served alcohol. After killing his parents, he began to beg and drink non-stop. Lloyd vomited blood and held his throat, dropping the mug. He died. The guy threw off the blanket and screamed that even if he had become an aristocrat, his life was as worthless as in Korea. He mentally turned to the absolute, remembered the notification sign, tried to understand what it was up to. He did not understand why he had stuck it in this body. Morning came, and the town under the mountains was illuminated by the sun. The white walls of the mansion shone in the sun. Xavier walked calmly behind the lady in the white dress, who was clarifying what Lloyd had done in the tavern last night. It was his mother, named Marbella Fra. Lloyd stood there shabby and realized that he had actually read a novel yesterday. An agitated Marbella asked her son to go and apologize to her. Lloyd did not let his mother finish and immediately agreed, guiltily scratching the back of his head. He understood that he was responsible for the program his body had committed yesterday. Marbella and even Xavier suddenly opened their eyes in surprise, which was noticed by the pop-up notification. The hero did not understand. Should he not be at least a little proud of himself? The sky above the medieval houses was clear and calm. A man was putting bales of straw into a cart. Something caught his attention. Xavier and Lloyd were approaching him along the street, along the barrels and windows. The frightened man immediately hid behind his cart without even thinking to look in the direction of those walking. Lloyd looked at him questioningly. All the passers-by on the street shuddered and ran in different directions, only noticing Lloyd with his companion. The surprise on Lloyd's face only grew. The little boy looked at the walking couple with curiosity. Then he was pulled inside the house with the words that he must not look at them. The window sashes slammed shut. A pop-up notification informed the boy that the villagers hated him. He replied that he had already noticed it. Lloyd walked without taking his hands out of his pockets and asked why Xavier was following him. Xavier kept his hand on the hilt of his sword and said that the Baron ordered him to guard Lloyd and make sure that Lloyd did not repeat yesterday. The hero asked again in surprise, "Did he really need to guard me?" Xavier calmly replied that it would be more accurate to protect the residents from him, to which the hero called himself a monster, not suspecting inside what he had done before. Lloyd looked around guiltily, realizing that he first needed to clean up his image so that at least someone would give him a piece of bread when he started begging. He mentally stopped himself, deciding that it would be better to somehow sort out his family debt first. He imagined himself bathing in huge honeycombs, realizing that in this case, as the successor to the owner of the village, he would be able to live in luxury for the rest of his life. Lloyd mentally asked if there were any cheats here. A blue window immediately appeared in front of him, and he was surprised that there were skills here. Lloyd's skills on the table were worthlessness and drunkard. Dissatisfied, Lloyd tried to knock this table down with his hands, but Xavier, who saw nothing, looked at his master with embarrassment. Lloyd, struggling with the table, went ahead. A savior called out to him and asked where he was going. Lloyd only turned to the white-haired man in confusion. There was a tavern on the side of the road. Xavier stopped at the level of the door, looking at the guilty gentleman, and pointed to the tavern, asking if the apology was really a lie. Lloyd began to deny it. Xavier fell silent in confusion. Indignant, Lloyd began to shower him with questions. Xavier closed his eyes and invited the gentleman to come in. Lloyd slowly opened the door, looked inside with an apology, to which Xavier, standing behind him, could not find words. He looked at the gentleman calmly, but internally understood that something was wrong with him since yesterday, as if he had become a different person. In the tavern, all the furniture was broken. Cracks were crawling along the wall. The trophy skulls were half broken. Lloyd fell heavily onto a chair and loudly declared that he wanted to apologize for his pranks. Xavier watched in surprise. The bald owner of the tavern took a fighting stance, which was noted by the blue notification window. Lloyd looked at the owner of the tavern, bewildered as he stuttered and asked the gentleman to stop. The hero thought that perhaps this happened because such a non-entity as he suddenly began to speak respectfully. Lloyd looked away, deciding to change his strategy briefly and rudely ask for forgiveness. The notification plate noted the inappropriate behavior of the apologetic man. The hero still could not understand what it required of him. The bald man, covered in sweat, bowed and stuttered that everything was fine and that the hero did not need to apologize. Lloyd remained silent in surprise but looked at the owner of the tavern. The sky was clear and bright. Xavier and Lloyd crossed a small bridge. The hero noted with difficulty that the innkeeper's face, even after the apology, was not very good. Xavier noted that this was not surprising. He looked at the guy and said that all the utensils and dishes that he had broken were bought with money earned with sweat and blood, and that perhaps only by receiving compensation would the innkeeper be satisfied. Lloyd was indignant, thinking that there were only debts at home and there could be no talk of compensation. He still could not admit that he could not look good in the eyes of the residents. The hero understood that if he did not sort out the debts, then nothing would work out, but he did not understand how to do this. Xavier continued the story, throwing the hero off track even more, saying that in addition to the program, the health of the inn's mother left much to be desired. Lloyd looked away, remembering the only fireplace in the inn, and how cold it was there. The boys walked on the bare ground while Lloyd continued to think about how hard it would be for old people to survive in such cold weather until they invented a floor heating system. The hero stopped while Xavier continued to walk. Lloyd stared into space in amazement. A light bulb went on in his head. He looked down thoughtfully, realizing that the light bulb in his head, sparkled. He realized that something had come to his mind. His eyes opened wide. The light bulb in his head burst into a flash of electricity. The hero compared it to a sudden XP explosion and the idea that came after it. A green line rushed through space. There were many more of them, and together they formed something big, taking shape more and more with each passing second. Lloyd diligently imagined a floor heating system in his head. He thought that if he created a heating system in this world, it would definitely sell. The hero imagined his body turning over tables and realized that the Fulfra had never even dreamed of it. He saw his true self above the body and told himself that this was possible for Kimu Ho. Kim-soo remembered many schemes in his head. He was a construction engineer, remembered how in the army he tried to build a house alone. He remembered how he carried piles of bricks on special carriers. He remembered how he worked day and night on construction sites. Lloyd smiled and mentally realized that this was his plan with which he would cover all the debts of the Baron's family. Encouraged, Lloyd turned around and told his frozen companion to return to the tavern. Lloyd turned and shouted that they were going to receive the first order. The notification announced the beginning of the hero's real journey. It said that the relationship point system was activated, said that the hero can gain reputation by interacting with others. At the moment, the amount of reputation was 0. Lloyd looked at the huge blue signs in front of his face in confusion. The hero frowned and thought, what PR was? Was it something like experience? A system window appeared that by improving relations with the main characters, he could get PR. He turned his head and thought that something was appearing above Xavier's head. The system window said that his interest level in Lloyd was -30. He thought that this was probably a very low level. The guy smiled nervously and turned to his companion. He smiled and said that he was very handsome. Xavier raised his eyebrows and said that he knew. A system window appeared that his interest level in the hero dropped to -31. Lloyd turned away and thought that he would leave it for later. If he continued, it would only get worse. After a while, the hero looked at the sheet in surprise and said that the customer was the innkeeper, the performer was Lloyd. He smiled and said, the construction costs are deducted from the amount of compensation for the damage caused. The innkeeper looked at him with a stony face. A system window appeared that he did not trust him. The skill mental wall emanated from him. The hero thought that this was their problem, not a drop of trust. The young man pursed his lips and thought that he could not ruin his grand plan from the very beginning. He did not want to use this method. He decided to use the characteristic of insignificance. Lloyd grimaced and said, we will see each other often, so we should trust each other. The innkeeper began to write on the paper. The hero thought that this trash really works. He smiled and thought that the first contract was signed. Xavier looked at him with distrust while Lloyd said that he made an excellent choice and would definitely not regret it. After a while, the guy held a shovel and thought that his plan was not that grand, so precise calculations were not required. He turned around when his companion called out to him. The blue-haired man frowned and said, you blackmailed the innkeeper and designed the contract. Was this really a new level of tyranny? Lloyd looked at him silently. He raised an eyebrow and asked if he really had no logic at all. Had he heard of cognitive distortion? The hero extended a finger and explained that distortion occurs because every cell in the brain is stereotypes and negative thoughts. As if it was like this in the past, then it will be like this in the future. Xavier looked at him and said that it was not a stereotype but experience and statistics. Lloyd looked at him and asked, "After all, experience and statistics are all in the past, aren't they?" The blue-haired man silently looked at him and thought, what was going on? Had he really formulated his thoughts so correctly before? He shuddered when Lloyd said that they would smile. The guy stuck the shovel into the ground and said that both the innkeeper and his mother would laugh with joy. He stuck the shovel deeper. The hero threw away the earth and thought that their smiles would be the foundation of his earnings. He wielded the shovel and thought that he needed to dig, move, compact the earth, and repeat. Lloyd hammered nails into the wood and thought that the lumber from the warehouse in the mansion would be an excellent basis for the central wooden frame. He lay down next to the building and thought that it was enough to apply river clay, and the frame was ready. The guy was covered in sweat and thought how weak his body was. Xavier came closer and said that he did it quickly. The hero shouted, "Did it really take a whole week?" The blue-haired man looked at him in surprise and thought that he was really building something. Where did he learn how to do this? Did he really decide to honor the contract for a rowdy like him? It was impossible. Lloyd stood up and said that his bones were aching, but there was no time to rest. He took the axe, then he swung, but suddenly he began to fall. His hand was caught. Xavier didn't let him fall. He took the axe from him. The guy looked back and asked what he needed to do. Lloyd answered with surprise that he needed boards measuring 1 span horizontally and 2 spans vertically. The blue-haired man threw up some logs. He swung bloodthirstily, and with one blow he chopped them. The perfect boards fell to the ground. The hero's jaw almost dropped. He gave him a thumbs up. The guy looked at his subordinates' backs and thought that he was definitely a swordmaster. He didn't even need modern tools. The brunette put his hand on the guy's shoulder and called him by name. He picked up the shovel and asked, "Will you help me with the digging when I finish?" Xavier frowned and thought that not only did he not thank him, but he also made him work. How could he forget about his character? A system window appeared that Xavier regretted his decision. Lloyd leaned over to him and asked if he had helped out of curiosity, that he would definitely cheat someone. But in what way? He wanted to see the result. Then what should be done, right? Finish what was started, and what should be done to finish it faster. The guy smiled and said that they needed to work together. Xavier looked at him irritably. He thought that the brunette was right, and for several days now he had been completely different, but he still could not trust him because of his past. The blue-haired man got to work and decided that he would be able to check it only after finishing the job. Xavier was digging with sweat on his brow. Lloyd was also working. He threw back the earth. The hero lifted the shovel triumphantly and stuck it into the ground. He raised his fist and shouted that the construction was complete. Lloyd looked defiantly at the sky. Xavier asked him what kind of hieroglyph it was. He replied that it was the logo of his brand. The hero looked back and asked if it was time for a check. He raised his head and continued, "Wasn't it time to see how he had fooled the innkeeper?" Xavier looked at him silently. The wind was rustling, the fireplace was crackling, smoke was coming out of the chimney of the house. The old woman was lying on the floor and saying how nice it was here. She was smiling and said that her joints were finally resting. The innkeeper raised his eyebrows and asked how this was possible. Lloyd smiled and thought that the people of this world could only be surprised. The old woman was smiling and thought that this power of heating the floors was almost like magic. The innkeeper looked at the hero and thanked him. He said that he had not seen his mother smile for a long time. Xavier opened his eyes in shock and thought that the innkeeper and his mother were laughing. As he said this, he looked at the hero and thought, how was this possible? In one morning, not only had his manner of speech and facial expression changed, but he also worked hard and even fulfilled his promise. The blue-haired man thought, did he really want to see these people smile? It was impossible. He was not that kind of person. The innkeeper and his mother were smiling. Xavier smiled and thought that he saw how happy they were. A system window appeared that Xavier's interest level had increased by 2 points and was now at -29. Lloyd smiled, looked around, and said that he probably thought he wasn't such a piece of trash. He said no, the hero said. He thought he was right. The guy smiled and thought that in any case the first order was completed, and even though he was in the red, it didn't matter. He thought it was because he had built this little house for advertising. A few days later, many people were standing in line. The man came out of the house and said, I thought it would melt. Lloyd slapped the table and asked how he was. Wasn't it hot? Wouldn't you like a room like that in your house too? He handed over a sheet of paper and said that Model A was a separate building in the yard and Model B was a remodel of the house. If you sign both orders, you will get a 10% discount. The man shrank back and began to refuse. A system window appeared that the villager did not trust Lloyd. He said that they would see each other often, which meant they should trust each other. He leaned over and asked if he really didn't believe him. For such a price, it was just a gift. The guy looked away when someone called out to him. His father looked at him and asked what he was doing here. A system window appeared that his interest level was -20. Lloyd frowned. In front of a mansion, the hero was sitting at a long dining table opposite his father. The guy glanced at him furtively and thought that he had been carefully avoiding him, afraid that the head of the family would forbid construction. The man calmly cut the sausage. The young man frowned when his father said that he was ready to listen to him. Arcus frowned and asked what he had come up with this time. The guy brought a fork with food and replied that the innkeeper had ordered floor heating and he had fulfilled it. He decided to avoid long explanations and act according to his character. The interlocutor looked at him and added that his son was now making contracts with other residents. The hero nodded. The man frowned and said that the residents were very important and valuable, and he would not forgive the boy if he deceived them. Lloyd closed his eyes and replied that he didn't have to worry about that, as the boy had expected. No matter what he did, no one believed him. The boy got up from the table and said that he was leaving since his father had nothing more to say. The hero tried to run away as quickly as possible. Arcus closed his eyes and assumed that his son was doing this because of the situation in their family. He frowned and assured him that he could quickly deal with such a trifle himself, so the boy didn't have to interfere. Lloyd turned around and looked at him sadly. He had heard these words before. His father had assured him the same thing in his past life, convincing him that the main thing was to study and not worry. The hero really thought that everything was fine. The brown-haired man pressed his lips together and thought that it was a lie, that nothing was right. He didn't want to become pathetic because of someone's lousy money. He moved toward the exit and asked his father not to give up because the boy would try to... A few years ago, when the hero had to say these words to his father, the boy was walking down the corridor and calculating that he had received 32 orders for Model A and 50 orders for Model B. The hero had already received almost half of the deposit. He stopped when he saw two men in front of him. They were the Lone Shark Show and Meatloaf. They passed by, and the young man was surprised that these two even greeted the Baron's son. The hero frowned, and an idea struck him. The guests entered Aris's office. One of them sat down leisurely on the edge of the table and asked how long the man would delay payment. The fat man added that more than 5 days had already passed, and if he continued to delay payments like this, they would not sit idly by. The Baron frowned and looked down. Sheo looked at him with disdain and said that if he sold the items in the house, the money would appear. The protagonist cautiously peered through the door. He smirked and mentally noted that it was timely. The guy grinned and thought that they appeared when needed. RP amount 36. The young man looked at the system window and noted that he received some points by improving his relationship with Savor. It remained to figure out where to use them. Notification. By investing the received points in talent, you can improve your abilities. The guy looked at the screen in surprise and noted that the messenger still knows how to explain normally. Next message. Damn, I will not explain. The hero hastened to apologize. Suddenly a circle lit up under Lloyd's feet. It began to rise higher up the young man's body. Knowledge, soil mechanics, hydrology, structural mechanics, water supply system, design of steel and concrete structures, the highest level of design. The system wrote that the hero surprisingly knows a lot. The brown-haired man frowned and shouted that he definitely needed to get a word in. Notification. Possible improvement of knowledge-based skills. Topographic survey base, required points, 15. Design base, required points, 15. The guy crossed his arms and thought that it was not entirely clear what and how, but there was enough RP and he could try. He clicked on both options. Skill name, topographic survey base. His eyes suddenly began to glow, and the hero leaned out the window with a scream. The young man saw a virtual grid for design in front of him. Lloyd was surprised that even without using GPS he could calculate everything just by seeing it with his own eyes. Skill name. Design base. The brown-haired man began to draw a diagram of the house right in the air in front of him. Just recently he had suffered drawing a project on a piece of paper. The hero sat down on the bed and thought that, in the future, of course, it would be much easier for him. But would Xavier's help alone be enough? The guy raised an eyebrow and dreamed that it would be nice to summon heavy equipment. The system reported that there was something to summon. The young man looked at the screen in shock. Random phantom selection. Using RP, you can summon a phantom. Different capabilities, different skills. Choose a phantom partner who will try his best for you in everything. The hero noted that this looked like an advertisement for the game. He squinted and saw on the screen that one phantom choice costs 50 RP. Lloyd frowned and realized that he did not have enough. Only 1 point remained. Meatloaf slammed his hand on the table and, looking at the Baron, said that he could suggest one way. If he didn't have a penny, he could sell his wife and children and get good money. Arcus looked at his interlocutor in shock and asked again. The hero extended his hand and demanded to see the invitation letter first. The moneylender stuttered in surprise. Lloyd bowed his head and said that the fundamental law of the kingdom states that all aristocracy are subjects of the king and have the right to protect their interests. He looked menacingly at the guests and declared that entering the residence of the aristocracy without an invitation letter is considered an intrusion, and this is contained in the law. The interlocutors got angry and shouted that this was nonsense. The young man raised an eyebrow and suggested that they all check together for the presence of the law. The guy frowned and called for Xavier. The knight entered the room and greeted the gentleman. The hero bared his teeth and ordered that the intruder's hand be cut off. The swordsman silently grabbed the handle of his weapon. The guests backed away in fear and shouted that they had completely lost their minds. The brown-haired man raised his chin and suggested that they check again whose side the court would take. Xavier threateningly bared his blade. The moneylenders began to sweat and looked at him in fear. The men quickly headed for the exit, shouting that they would make him regret it. The door quickly slammed behind them. Lloyd chuckled and called them worthless. The Baron turned to the boys and they looked at him. The man jumped up and asked what they had just done in a situation where they had to beg on their knees. The boy silently put the bag on the table, then smiled and said that he had originally wanted to get the entire deposit and give it back. But this amount was also enough to pay this month's interest. The father looked at him in shock and asked if this was really the money collected from the villagers. The knight closed his eyes and asked the Baron not to worry. He looked at the owner and promised that he would make sure the boy fulfilled the terms of the contract. Arcus looked closely at the swordsman and thought that his expression showed that he completely trusted him. Lloyd bowed and said that in that case, they would go. The boys walked down the corridor. Xavier glanced sideways at the master and said that he did not expect the fool to know such laws. The interlocutor frowned and exclaimed that he had simply heard it somewhere. It was true, Xavier himself told about it in the novel. After the Baron and his wife committed suicide, 2 Monal and ERS wanted to dig up the bodies and sell them. Then the knight, voicing this law, cut their necks. In court, the guy was completely acquitted. The hero closed his eyes with satisfaction and thought that it was a big plus to know the contents of the novel. The young man smiled and noted that a notification should have arrived by now. Notification: Baron's interest has increased by 6 points. By improving relations with the main character, you receive 60 RP, quantity 61. Lloyd smiled, thinking that everything happened as he planned, to get the phantom as soon as possible. The moon was shining in the night sky. The hero was standing on the training ground. He looked around to make sure there was no one around. The guy looked at the system window and applied a random drawing of fantastic creatures. The young man pressed the button and looked at the glow in front of him. Gears were spinning in the air. Lloyd looked up in shock at the sight of such magic. A magic circle was hanging in front of him. The brown-haired man turned pale and thought that this spell was very weak and small. It just made an annoying noise. Something lit up from the magic circle, after which a mouse's head appeared. The aristocrat stared at it in shock. The animal jumped to the ground and looked at the guy. He silently looked at the mouse and grimaced in disappointment. The creature looked at its new owner in fear, after which it began to squeak loudly. The hero turned to him and asked if he could do a lot of things. Shooting acorns was not what he needed. The mouse waved its paw, refuting what the master had said. The guy asked it to show him what it could do. The little animal began to chew something vigorously, after which it spat out 2 pieces of paper. The hero unfolded them with disgust and read the contents. It turned out that the creature peed on was a cute hamster, which the system asked to take care of with love. He shook out sunflower seeds into his palm. It was said that they could change the structure of the animal. Red sunflower seed Pyong would become huge. The effect would disappear in 12 hours. Blue sunflower seed Pyong would become small. Feed this seed to the hamster before the effect of the red seed ends. The young man looked at the paper and read that a set of 2 seeds costs 1 RP. He looked at the hamster and asked if it grows to the size of a human. Pyong squeaked in response, and the hero realized that he needed to check for himself. The boy gave the hamster a seed and thought that the animal should be good at digging and could be useful if it became the size of a human. Pyong began to chew the seed. The aristocrat looked in surprise as it began to glow and increase in size. Something pushed the hero and he flew back. Lloyd stared at him in shock and turned pale. A 5-me hamster stood in front of him now. It was at least 10 mm. Padong looked at his owner with disdain. Padong's skill, digging level 1. The animal began to dig actively, leaving a ditch behind it. Pyong's skill, strengthening the earth, level 1. The hamster rolled over on its back and began to compact the soil. Padong's skill, puffing out its cheeks, level 1. The animal puffed out its cheeks and spat out a boulder. The stone plopped down in front of the hero. The young man smiled and was glad that the problem with the heavy equipment was solved. Lloyd walked down the corridor, his hands in his pockets. He wondered if people would be suspicious if the guy suddenly showed up with this magical creature. The hero grinned and decided that he would carry a summoning book with him and tell everyone that he was a genius summoner. The nobleman looked ahead and remembered that it was time to solve the problem with workers for a large-scale construction project. The next day, the young man stood in front of a group of people with shovels and ordered them to repeat after him. He squeezed the handle of the tool and shouted that safety was above all. The 30 men from the barony army looked at the gentleman absent-mindedly and sluggishly repeated the phrase. The brown-haired man smiled tensely and thought that these guys looked like soldiers who were paid but did not work. He was surprised that they had not been dispersed yet, considering that the baron had a lot of debt. The boy smiled and pointed out that that was why they wouldn't get any overtime bonuses. It was good that they had manpower. Lloyd frowned and shouted that they were soldiers, and when they got together, they were an army. The hero threw his shovel over his shoulder and said that their essence was to complete tasks. The young man remembered that when he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than training. The nobleman pointed to a pile of earth and said that he dug it up after working all night. In fact, Padong dug it all up in half an hour. The brown-haired man put his hand on his belt and shouted that the first task was to revive the estate. This was a boiler room project. For the people of the estate to make it, the soldiers had to move the earth to the construction site. The men looked at the master with disappointment. The hero had expected them to react like that. Someone came up behind him and called out. The senior knight of the Newman barony looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he had ordered his men to do. Lloyd smirked and thought that he had expected the man to speak up. There were 3 knights in this estate: Newman, his subordinate Bayan, and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Asahan. At the beginning of the novel, only Bayan and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. The senior knight looked at the boy with displeasure. It was this man who had been the first to betray and abandon the Baron, since it was Newman who had sold information about the Baron to swindlers. He owed a hefty debt. The hero looked at the swordsman with disdain and wondered how such a man could even be the senior knight. The young man looked at his interlocutor with a grin and asked him what he thought they were doing. The man frowned and said that he could not believe that an aristocrat was forcing the militia to do dirty work. He added that, as head of the knights, he could not tolerate this. The guy leaned on the shovel and thought it was nonsense, because the hero was earning money to pay off his debts. He said that he had obtained the baron's permission. The knight stood opposite the aristocrat. Newman said that he did not know how the young man had outwitted his lord, but offered to recall the young master's past. The man frowned and suggested that his interlocutor was using the militia forces for personal gain. The brown-haired man closed his eyes, then smiled and replied that he was right. The hero glared menacingly at the warrior and warned that he would get it now. The warrior's face instantly distorted with anger and irritation. Just think of his weak self-control. If the knight had tried to play an online game, he would have exploded in a minute. Lloyd pulled the tool out of the ground and swinging threw sand at his interlocutor. The soldiers stared at them in shock. The man covered his eyes with his hand in displeasure, and the brown-haired man only grinned. The swordsman was shaking with anger. He looked at the young man angrily and was indignant that he had really tried to tarnish the knight's reputation. In his mind, Newman called him the stupid son of a nearly bankrupt baron. The hero put his hand to his ear and asked if his interlocutor really wanted to throw away his regalia and fight. The guy swung his shovel and pointed it at the flushed man, raised his eyebrows and warned that the young man would regret it. Fr Estate, the hero was going to duel Newman in a month. Xavier looked at the gentleman and asked if he was so sure of his victory. The aristocrat was sitting on the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at the knight and exclaimed that he was not. The boy added that his opponent was a knight called the Heart of Mana and a junior sword expert, and he himself was just a laser bones. Naturally, he was not up to fighting him. The young man asked if the other man had even thought about it before asking such a question. Xavier frowned in irritation and squeezed the hilt of his sword. Then the warrior loosened his grip and noted that he had almost cut down the gentleman. He looked at the hero, picking his nose, and could not believe that he had suddenly thrown dirt at the Newman knight and even asked for a duel. Perhaps the young man wanted to be a scoundrel again. However, the boy himself asked the Baron for a favor, then entered into an argument and pushed Xavier away. By this time he had appointed Knight Baron as a temporary manager and was in charge of the construction team. However, the young man was unsure about this duel. The brown-haired man pulled a booger out of his nose, and the other man immediately wanted to hack him to death. The hero wiped his hands and said that the knight had to do something. The young man smiled and asked to be taught how to handle a sword. The other man frowned and said that he did not want to. The aristocrat looked at him with disappointment and asked why. The swordsman replied that first of all it was his duty to protect the young master. The blond man looked calmly at Lloyd and added that he was like a sack, and if a sack learned fencing it would be even more dangerous to be around him. The aristocrat asked to at least speak more softly. The brown-haired man once again clarified whether the knight really did not want to teach him. The hero smiled confidently and said that he would deal with his insomnia in exchange. Sayer looked at the gentleman in shock, not understanding how he knew about it. The young man grinned and thought that thanks to the novel, he also knew the reason for his insomnia. In the work The Knight of Iron and Blood, knights are divided into 4 levels by rank: Swordmaster, Supreme Sword Expert, Middle Sword Expert, Junior Sword Expert. Xavier's level is Supreme Sword Expert, and he will soon become a Master Swordmaster. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called Swordmaster Syndrome. The brown-haired man leaned on his hands and thought that in the countryside they do not know such things, so the knight himself does not know either. The hero looked at his interlocutor and asked if he agreed to the deal, because it was written on his face that he had insomnia. Xavier sighed and replied that he would try. The nobleman smiled and asked him not to give in to him. The swordsman chuckled and said that he was saying this because the young man would definitely fail. He had tried many things to cure his insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatherapy, exercise, oriental medicine, and the like. The KN was sleeping peacefully in a chair, hugging a pillow. The protagonist stood in front of him and chuckled that he knew exactly how to cure insomnia. The 18th magic technique is reading a manual on reinforced concrete structures. This is what puts you to sleep. The guy grinned and thought that all the swordsman's skills would now be his. The sun was shining in the sky. The refreshed and well-rested knight looked at the master and ordered him to run 50 laps. The hero looked at the warrior in surprise, then turned around and ran. The swordsman turned to look at the master and was amazed that he ran without complaint. Lloyd was running circles around the training ground. He ran up to the knight and muttered in a tired voice that he hated it and was to learn something. After these words, the guy ran on. Having completed the next circle, the hero smiled at his interlocutor and asked if he expected that the aristocrat would not be able to, and would whine. The warrior continued to watch the gentleman running circles. At the next turn, the sweaty guy exclaimed that the knight would have simply said that the young man was not cut out for it and waved him off. Xavier shuddered because the interlocutor guessed right. The brown-haired man ran on with a laugh, shouting that he would run to the end. Notification: passive skill ugliness increased to level 4. Anyway, one who sees you will take you for a freak and will feel the desire to punch you. The young man got angry and exclaimed that he did not have such a skill. The hero was sweating and breathing heavily. It would be a lie to say that he was not tired. However, this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning, the boy opened his eyes to a crowded Gishian. Every day, he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night, the boy loaded trucks with boxes just to not die of hunger, always dreaming that someday it would get better. The young man encouraged himself that he was doing well, was qualified, and there was still a little bit left, but the light he was reaching for suddenly went out, and the hero was left alone with the darkness. Compared to that pain and despair, This was nothing. Lloyd ran under the moonlight and smiled. The knight continued to stand nearby. He looked closely at the master and thought that he would teach him his fencing technique if the aristocrat was so sincere. The brown-haired man continued to turn circles. Notification: Xavier's opinion of you has increased by 1. His opinion of you is 28. You've received 18 RP for slightly improving your relationship with a key character. Score: 29 RP. The manor was illuminated by the moon. The Baron sat at the table and looked at Newman standing in front of him. The man could not believe that his son would be so rude to the one who had protected their family for 5 generations. Arcus leaned on his hands and muttered that he thought the boy had come to his senses, but he must have misunderstood him. He looked at the swordsman and said that it was his moral duty not to interfere with the duel. Still, the Baron asked him not to be too cruel to the heir to the estate. The lord looked at his interlocutor intently and ordered that the boy be brought to his senses, but not crippled. Vaman bowed and accepted the request. The knight smirked and thought that he did not know if he could do it during the duel. He walked down the corridor determined to kill this arrogant bastard, and if the Baron made a big deal out of it, he would destroy him and the Baroness too, and pass it off as suicide. The swordsman smiled and thought that, as planned, he would then leave this village for a better place. Thanks to the young master, his plan was coming to fruition faster than he expected. A month passed. Spectators gathered around the training ground to watch the nobleman and the knight standing opposite each other. The protagonist's parents were sitting under the canopy, looking nervous.